everybody to the Reefer Festival. Thank you all for availing your time and joining us within this segment of the festival. And this session is basically stream 4 and session 2. And we're basically going to engage in the African trade and the formal and the informal economy and livelihoods. Please introduce yourself in the chat, share your name and basically where you're from. And then please do not hesitate to ask any questions as we go along to the speakers and basically all of us. Thank you. So basically the purpose of this stream is to basically share some enlightenment on how basically African trade and the informal economy and livelihoods have impacted to basically how we live today, in alignment with the, what do you call this? In alignment with the coronavirus. So yes, that is what we will be diving into today. And we have two guests, namely our first speaker goes by the name of Mr. Kalbesa Mekhersa. He is basically he's currently a researcher working for the Institute of Development Studies within the Business, Markets and State Research Cluster. He also supports the UK department, which is basically for the international development and the Foreign Commonwealth Office. He does this through the K4D program, which basically seeks to improve the impact of the development policy and also the programming within the use of the evidence within the policy. And then another thing that he also associates himself with is that he is interested in broad areas of development research, and his main areas of expertise begin with development finance, taxation, private sector development, and basically he basically does this in developing countries. Previously, he worked as an independent consultant and as a researcher for the Belgian Policy Research Group, and which is basically called the BFIND of Namir. So that is our first speaker. Yeah, I can just allow him to introduce himself and then we can introduce our second speaker. Well, to share his greetings, basically.
So do I start my presentation now, Zulika, or you want to introduce Sia as well? Or
you can start your presentation now. It's okay, sir. I'll introduce Mr. Sia when he starts his presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and thanks, Zulika, for your wonderful introduction. And it's an interesting topic. Today, my presentation is going to be about the informal sector and COVID-19 in sub-Saharan Africa. This presentation is based on a paper I wrote, in fact, towards the beginning of the COVID crisis. So some aspects might have diverged a bit, but I still think there is quite some interesting things we can find from it. Just to make sure that my voice is heard clearly and there is no lag, I will turn off my video now that you have seen my face. Okay, all right. So the informal sector is really important for sub-Saharan Africa, and by some estimates, in fact, about 80% of workers in the region are employed in the informal economy. Informal workers such as street vendors, market traders, market porters, and workers like them, they do provide essential goods and services to the community, but particularly to the urban poor. The urban poor often buy necessities of life at lower prices in rather smaller quantities from those informal workers or informal traders. Sometimes or oftentimes in some countries, they operate without legal recognition and without being offered the necessary securities. Despite that, they do offer vital functions through their informal trade. They are very crucial in particular areas, for example, in the food sector of urban areas. Particularly, they offer food security for the urban poor. But apart from food security for the urban poor, they provide jobs, especially for women or especially less skilled or less literate women. Informal traders are also very easily accessible, unlike high-end or formal supermarkets, so to say. They tend to sell produce at much lower prices than formal supermarkets. They can sometimes offer goods or services with credit because they tend to know their customers as well. They allow smaller amounts to be transacted and so on. And by some estimates, more than a third of households in sub-Saharan Africa, they rely on informal food supplies for their access to food. So then you can see what sort of an important jobs they do. Since COVID, the arrival of COVID, there has been considerable impacts and shocks to this sector and to these workers. Even before the arrival of COVID, the vast majority of informal workers in the region, they don't really have good health and safety precautions, and they were already susceptible to risks. And the arrival of COVID has only exacerbated those health and safety risks. For that reason, and also because of the very nature of their work, they are more vulnerable to COVID-19 and associated health risks, and also economic shocks. They also suffer from other underlying problems, for example, vulnerabilities from state supervision. Sometimes police men and women tend to rough informal workers and so on. The arrival of COVID has also meant that there are extra checks and restrictions. These are only added to the challenges that they face. Marketers often work in crowded conditions. Street hawkers have very little access to hand washing facilities, for example, and also informal cross-border traders have to come to terms with irregular enforcements and travel bans and so on. Unlike other better off parts of the community, say workers in the formal sector, informal traders have very low saving, often zero saving. Their access to finance is also restricted. Their access to digital financial platforms is limited. And they live in overcrowded slum areas. So they don't really have a lot of financial buffer also for the sort of harsh restrictions, especially that were in place at the outset of the crisis. Few days of absence from work can lead to considerable financial setback to them. So this has really affected them. Some surveys, for example, in a Kenyan slum in Nairobi has shown from a study on 2,000 informal workers, about 81% of them have faced partial or complete loss of income at the height of restrictions. 70% of those that were studied of the 2,000 informal workers reported missing meals because of COVID-19 and associated restrictions, and about a third of them could not afford to buy sanitary equipments like hand gels or soaps and so on. Next, I will say a bit about the particular impact of these restrictive measures. We could go on to talk about those specific restrictions. Just for the sake of clarification, a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa did introduce lockdown measures and restrictions a lot more stringently at the outset of the crisis. Over time, as the community got weary and as the adverse effects of those restrictions really piled up, and there was also a lot of pushback from the community through protests and so on, those restrictions have been considerably scaled back in later months. In Ethiopia, for example, there were restrictions of movements, transportations in different federal states. In Ghana, there were restrictions, especially in large urban agglomerations where informal workers are actually active. In Kenya, very similar story in Mombasa, Kilifi, Kwale, and so on. In Tanzania, there was a much lax approach, thus we didn't see as much adverse effects at the beginning. You often, this just goes to show how the top political class views the crisis itself affects the health care responses, because Tanzania at first was really not too concerned about the crisis, primarily because of the president, who unfortunately is thought to have passed away because of COVID itself. So in Uganda, Zambia, and many other countries, there were restrictions that really did affect, urban restrictions that really did affect the informal workers. What sort of impacts were there? We have a sort of a mixed assessment. On the one hand, those restrictions have caused considerable financial setbacks to informal workers. On the other hand, directly linked to the crisis, as other formal sectors of the economies of countries in the region suffered, the informal sector tended to have swelled more, because quite a bit of those formal workers either became informal workers themselves, or because of restrictions, they started to rely on those informal traders a lot more. So most people will not go to the city centers, markets are closed, so they start to buy food, let's say, from around, from an informal shop around the corner and so on. Some economists even forecast that if these trends continue, we might even see a much bigger restructuring of the economy that might even favor the informal sector. So as I said, informal traders have particularly adversely suffered from lockdown restrictions in urban areas. In Ghana, for example, because of school, workplace, transport closures, and so on, and because street hawkers and so on were prohibited to operate as before, and secondly, their potential buyers would not come into the city centers or high streets, then they saw their demand decline. So you see a much more bigger effect. In Uganda, food vendors were affected because there were some severe restrictions on the way markets operated. They started to create spacing. That means there were fewer vendors that could operate. There were specific timing in which they could operate. That meant then fewer hours to sell their items. Specific personal protection requirements were there, let's say masks or gloves. At this moment, these things might look easy to access, but at the outset of the crisis, there's PPE equipments were hard to come by, so they did suffer in such a way. Informal cross-border traders, these are also important in most African countries. Because of these movement restrictions and because truckers that also ferry those workers across borders stopped traveling, they considerably suffered. These are often people that buy item in one country and just cross over the border and sell in other countries. So we have seen this in West Africa, especially where informal cross-border trade is a bit higher than other African regions. There was also an impact on rural informal workers, or what we call off-farm workers. Often these tend to be even much more informed than their urban counterparts, and because of lack of awareness and because of considerable disruption to sell their items into to get it to the market, because often their produces had to be ferried to towns and city centers, and there was considerable disruption to transportation. They did really suffer as well. There were some targeted policies by governments in the region to deal with those adverse setbacks. One kind of policy is to create a special enabling environment or market environment. For example, in Ethiopia, the fruit and vegetable market was moved to an open space. Normally, this was quite in the city center, and since spacing requirements, social distancing requirements require a much bigger space if you have to create a market for equal number of traders, then they needed a bigger space. So it was moved to the much more crowded city center market into an open market. In Ghana, the municipalities were offering disinfectants and so on, because oftentimes those informal traders are too poor to buy them. In Mali, about 70,000 washable masks were distributed, for example, partially through the help of the European Union. In Mozambique, the Ministry of Health tried to help in improving hygiene and sanitation initiatives in these markets. In Rwanda, in Kigali, for example, they have shifted food trading from the city to another distance place, sort of a move just like Ethiopia. and so on and so forth. Another thing that some countries and governments in the region did was to reduce fees and costs of traders. So there was a certain market fee that they used to pay in normal times, and because of this complicated set of shocks that are adversely affecting these workers and impoverishing them, a lot of this market fees and associated costs were lowered for them. In some countries such as Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Namibia, Nigeria, dedicated funds were created to enable the federal as well as local municipalities to deal with this. For example, to subsidize or offset the lowering of fees, or to cover personal protection or hygiene resources, or for example in setting up specific marketplaces and so on. Another thing governments did was in helping to expand digital and cashless transactions. So this would obviously lower the risks that come from direct contact using cash, and at the same time also the requirement of the lower requirement of mobility through the use of these digital things. So the demand and supply of the market can be better helped. Another thing is targeted financial support to those specific informal workers that are affected. Some countries and NGOs are already working on this. In some places, targeted communities and informal workers already have electronic and biometric ID cards. So you can even inject or give a certain lump sum of cash to these workers and so on. Mauritius, for example, has tried to do this a little bit. In Zambia as well, the government has expanded emergency cash transfers, for example, and so on. But this has been seen in the slightly better of governments than the other countries. In some cases, there has also been support for informal cross-border traders. In East Africa, for example, an organization called the Grain Trade Business Hub of the East African Grain Council has tried to facilitate informal cross-border trade. In Southern Africa, for example, there was also a policy initiative that was implemented to ease such things. For example, in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, this has been done to a limited extent, but particularly in West Africa, there has been some limited successes in this. This in part links because even in normal times, there is a lot more stronger cross-border trade. Let's say, for example, between Nigeria and other smaller countries around it, even in normal times. Okay, so just to conclude, the arrival of COVID has meant that informal workers, informal traders, informal cross-border traders of farm informal workers, mind you, informal workers does not include farmers. So this group have considerably suffered, but their suffering has eased over time because one, government restrictions have considerably eased, and second, business activities and movement of people has considerably rebounded. This is a complete departure, of course, in richer countries. This is because vaccine penetration has been higher, but in a lot of countries in the region, this is not because people have become vaccinated, but just there has been a fatigue, and economic setbacks have been bigger. So largely life has resumed as before. In a lot of countries in the region, national and local governments have identified sort of replicable ways of keeping informal traders working. The intervention has been particularly stronger in the food sector, informal food traders, it means. This is because this is a very essential, these are the most essential of those traders, perhaps, let's say, compared to informal closed trader and so on. And also making them stop working is going to mean a lot of urban poor are going to go hungry as well, who buy from them. Multiple direct and indirect channels through which informal traders, there has been multiple direct and indirect channels through which COVID-19 has added to the loss of income and vulnerability, and also healthcare risks of this group of workers. However, they have proved to be quite resilient despite the health and associated economic crisis. The sector has in fact become quite vibrant and even expanded in a lot of countries in the region. That would be the end of my presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your presentation. To all our attendees, please just don't forget to insert your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll attend to them near to the end of the session. So now we're going to continue, and we're basically going to introduce our second guest speaker. And thank you so much, Mr. Kalbesa, for your knowledge and sharing the broad basically broad scenarios and facts of what happens outside of inside Africa, basically, because most of us don't know the actual critical details. Thank you for your presentation, sir. And now I will be introducing to you Mr. Siya Binza. So he is a political economist and applied advisor with an insightful understanding in international finance, public policy, the political, economic development, and regional integration in Africa, along with development economics. And also, Mr. Siya Binza has also served in a variety of leadership positions in the South African government and the NGO sector. He is skilled and experienced in strategic planning, research, governance, development finance, and management. So we will have our panelist, Mr. Siya, to basically share his views and his thoughts, and basically his views and perspective on this topic of the session. Thank you, Mr. Siya. Over to you.
Thank you, Zalega. So my presentation will pretty much complement the presentation by Kalbesa, who focused largely on the sort of micro experience of the informal sector and informal traders on the continent. I will be focusing more on the macroeconomic issues, focusing also on region processes that are taking place, as well as the impact then on the current trade and the new emerging dynamics, as well as the possibilities for further improvement in terms of catering for the informal sector, but also improving livelihoods of all traders and pretty much all Africans on the continent. Presentation. All right. start off just giving an overview of my presentation. I'll start off with an introductory overview of the impact of COVID-19 on African economies, then looking at some of the processes that are also taking place whilst we're faced with the pandemic in terms of African regional integration, and looking back at where we are versus the process and how it's unfolded over the past. And then I'll go into looking at what specifically African countries are trading, what are their major exports, and the impacts and the implications of that, as well as what we're currently importing from the rest of the world, as well as the implications for that. And then I'll be looking at some of the new emerging trade trends and how governments need to intervene in order to effectively create a new normal. I don't think that, as most people at the beginning of the pandemic thought, that we would return to a pre-COVID normal, that I think we're going to have to create the new normal. And in many ways, the new normal will be very different from the past and what we've experienced. And then I'll close off on an overview of the impact of these trade dynamics on the informal economy, as well as livelihoods on the continent.
So just before you start, I'm wondering if you should just switch your video off to preserve the bandwidth, because we're looking at the screen anyway.
Sure, no problem. The first thing I wanted to look at is the economic impact of COVID-19. As you can see, across the globe, a lot of countries faced significant collapse of economic growth. And the African economy, particularly maybe Southeast Asian region, seems to have been the worst affected across the globe. And on the continent, if you look at the top three economies, South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, only one of these was able to register positive growth, with Egypt registering a growth of 3.6% in 2020. And South Africa contracting by 7%, whilst Nigeria contracted for less than about 1.8%. But overall, some of the key dynamics that are taking place is that conflict-ridden areas have faced a worse economic impact due to complete trade isolation, as well as the response in terms of national response in terms of closing of borders. And one example of this is Libya, which registered a contraction of around 60% of GDP in 2020. So that's more than half of the economy that Libya lost in terms of its production in 2020. And another impact was on small island developing states, your SIDs, which was severely affected due to geographic isolation largely. And here the key examples are Cabo Verde, Mauritius, the Seychelles, and Sao Tome and Principe to some extent. But really, these economies were severely affected and have registered growth or contractions above 10% in all of the examples that I've mentioned. And another dynamic that's been taking place is that countries that were dependent on commodities in terms of their exports have also faced a more severe economic impact. And here we're looking at examples such as Angola, the DRC, and Republic of Congo. And of course, countries that were already in a difficult economic condition and in a recession, effectively, like South Africa and some of our neighboring countries, have had it the worst in terms of the compounding impact of COVID-19, in addition to already existing challenges. And of course, the pandemic took place at a time when the African continent had just signed the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and was really consolidating a process that has taken place over decades of unifying Africa, but also increasingly focusing more on unifying for trade or for business or competition in a global economy. And of course, this process of regional integration has rolled out in sort of three eras, if I can call it that. Initially, obviously being unified by the need to defeat colonialism. And this is largely the period from almost the founding of the Organization of Unity, leading up to the period of the early 2000s with the founding of the African Union, which then started a new sort of revival of what unified African countries with a much stronger push towards, Pan-Africanism and standing up for Africa interests in a global economy. And of course, the key defining factor of these periods was that regional integration was largely driven by charismatic leadership as opposed to the current period, which is now increasingly being driven by the economic imperative of increasing intra-regional trade, imperative of increasing the value addition of African countries in terms of their exports into the global economy. But centrally to all of this is that countries have also been struggling with how to resolve two legacies of colonialism that still trouble the continent today. One being the arbitrary nature of national borders, which doesn't really overlap or coincide with the development of national states. So as a result, we've either had contestation over control over the state, largely also driven by ethnic identities, which has led to civil conflict in a number of countries on the continent. And in the only case where these borders have been reconsidered, in the case of Sudan with the creation of South Sudan, we're still at a very fragile stage in terms of the development of the state of South Sudan. And after having recently had its 10-year anniversary, the country still hasn't passed a constitution, still hasn't formed a democratically elected government, with the current transitional leadership still struggling to implement some of the agreements that form part of the split and the creation of South Sudan. The other, obviously, is the major economic legacy of colonialism, which is the dependence on commodity exports. And this is a legacy which the African regional integration process has sought to resolve more directly. This through the creation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is targeted at increasing intra-regional trade, but also at pushing for industrialization and further local value addition, as opposed to the current dependency on raw commodity exports to the rest of the world. So what are African countries actually exporting, and what was the impact of COVID-19 on exports on the continent? What you see on the left in the top image is a breakdown of the top 5 exports from the continent. And these account for more than half of our total exports at $122.4 billion in 2020. This is a significant drop from around $175 billion in 2019, which the top 5 exports accounted for. However, it's still relatively in the same range that, the top 5 exports accounting for more than half of our total exports, and a large majority of that being crude oil, which accounts for about a quarter of our total exports, followed by gold and other agriculture and raw mineral exports. But what we've seen in 2020 and the impact of COVID-19 is that exports on the continent, total exports have declined quite significantly by about $50 billion from 273 billion in 2019 to where they were at 225 billion in 2020. And again, really the issues and the driving dynamics there again is that countries with commodity exports have had a more significant impact in terms of their exports. And you might remember that in 2020 also, oil markets collapsed, with oil reaching or going below $0 a barrel at some stage, largely due to oversupply in the global economy and uncertainties about future demand, given the global lockdown situation we were in. And what we've seen since then is a slight recovery, but obviously there has been a significant impact on exports, with oil exports almost halving if you look at the value depicted in the graph on the right. And again, this has had an impact on the balance of payments for African countries, largely due to the deteriorating terms of trade. So what that means is that the value of our exports as African countries has actually decreased, whilst the value of the goods we import has either remained stable or increased. So as a result, African countries, particularly those also who depend on commodity exports, have been faced with deteriorating terms of trade and balance of payment problems, which also have a knock-on impact on the potential for them to industrialize. And what we've seen as a response to this is that there's been countries coming together through the African Union and other regional economic communities in order to stand up for some of the interests of countries by putting pleas to the IMF in terms of providing further concessional lending to these countries who face balance of payment problems, but also on the part of their creditors to provide debt service relief, so that countries can reallocate monies that would have been allocated towards servicing debt towards the public health care response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what exactly are African countries importing? And you'll notice that the figures in terms of the top 5 top 5 imports rather, is far lower than what we saw in the exports. And the top 5 imports accounting for about just under a quarter of our total imports at $61 billion. And this speaks to the diverse number of goods that we need to import, but the top goods being imported are petroleum, motor vehicles, medicaments, which are medicines basically, wheat, as well as ICT equipment, largely cell phones in that category, as well as rice. So there's all these opportunities for import substitution industrialization. What that means is there's an opportunity for African countries to create or beneficiate some of the exports that they're exporting in order to replace or substitute the imports that they import from the rest of the world. For example, in a region that is the where the top export is crude oil, the top import is petroleum. And this speaks to lack of refining capacity on the continent, but also lack of industrialization on the continent. And it's a clear opportunity where through investment and improving local capacity to refine crude oil into petroleum, we could eliminate a significant portion of our imports, around about 10%, just over 10%, based on the 2020 figures. And if you look at some of the other items, such as medicines, wheat, and rice, which we could produce locally, and we've seen also, again, countries coming together, whether that be through the South Africa-India-led TRIPS waiver in order to enable developing countries to produce medicines and vaccines locally. Countries have started a process of advocating for some localization of these top imports. And obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has been an interesting crisis that has highlighted some of the strategic gaps in our dependence on imported medicines, which we could be producing locally if we do have concerted investment in local production of pharmaceuticals. And again, there's just the COVID-19 moment has highlighted the strategic significance of substituting our imports on medicines through local production. And as we've seen with the global hoarding of vaccines, but also the divergence in terms of access and equitable distribution of vaccines, which I'll also speak to, as that also has an impact on the recovery. So some of the new trends, as I mentioned, that there's a possibility that African countries could replace some of their imports through a process of concerted or targeted import substitution industrialization. but this will require strategic industrial policy interventions in order to attract investment in refining capacity on the continent, so that we're no longer exporting crude in order to import petroleum. Secondly, there are other areas where we could do the same. And as you've seen, our reliance on automotive imports and the opportunity created by the strong export of vehicles, particularly in Southern Africa. And as you can see, in all of the regions have got a dependence on motor vehicle imports, which could be potentially catered for through the productive capacity that exists in nodes across the continent, whether that be in Southern Africa, West Africa, or North Africa, in the case of the countries which have capacity, such as Ghana, Nigeria, Algeria, and South Africa. And then lastly is the issue of strategic need to replace some of our imports, such as medicines, but also things that we can produce locally, such as wheat and rice, that we don't necessarily need to be imported from the rest of the world. So what you have here is a table just highlighting some of the top imports and exports. On the left is the top exports in each region. Again, what we saw as an aggregate of the continental exports, obviously being paralleled here at a regional level, with crude oil still contributing a significant chunk, particularly in Central and West Africa, as a proportion of exports. Again, gold and other mineral commodity exports playing a significant role in Southern Africa and the rest of the continent. And then here on the right-hand side, we've got the top 5 imports according to each region. And again, they highlight the possibility of us being able to substitute some of these imports with local production if we do have concerted industrial policy to drive investment in these sectors. So what does this mean for the informal economy as well as livelihoods? You'll notice that in a lot of what I've discussed at a macro level, there seems to be this sort of disconnect between what was outlined by Kalbesa's presentation in terms of the areas that informal traders trade in, whether that be informal traders in the national context providing goods to the working poor, or even cross-border traders who buy and sell goods across borders. There seems to be a disconnect in the conversations that are happening at a continental level versus the impact at an informal economy level, where a large portion of the population still depend on. So there's a constant optimism about the fact that Africa's continental free trade area provides a market now that has about 1.2 billion consumers, but at the same time, without finding a way to integrate the 60 or 70% of this population who relies on informal economy, the free trade area agreement is going to be empty. And again, without finding ways to strategically replace some of the imports, we will not make the most out of this continental free trade area agreement, just purely on the back of African countries not being able to produce some of the goods locally, but also lacking capacity, such as refining capacity, to replace some of the imports. So this inequality between the macro level at a trade level and the informal economy level is also kind of replicated at a global level. And what is depicted here is the capacity to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic in each country. And the red is largely depict areas where governments have been able to only spend a maximum of 2.5% of GDP in responding, that whether that be in terms of public health care expenditure, in terms of supporting livelihoods or economic recovery from COVID-19, and all the various measures such as concessional lending, etc., which governments have provided in response. And you can see that a vast majority of the African continent is in that less than 2.5% category, with the exceptions being South Africa and I think that's Lesotho at 7.5% or between 5 and 10% of GDP in terms of the economic recovery, as well as some exceptions in the Sahel and the West Africa region. But it's quite clear that in the developed world, you're talking North America and you're talking Europe, countries have been able to respond, in upwards of 10% of GDP in terms of their economic response. So on the African continent as a whole, the IMF's total lending capacity is currently increased to about $1 trillion. Obviously, this doesn't represent all the borrowings or the lending to African countries as a whole, but this has been the only form of assistance that a lot of African countries have been able to access in the COVID-19 pandemic, which is paling in comparison to the global response of around 11.1 or 11.7 trillion dollars. If you consider some of the spending that's taken place in the US, as well as the European Union and the globe as a whole. And similarly, in terms of direct fiscal stimulus, African countries have only been able to provide stimulus of around $49 billion. And you might remember that in 2020 alone, we lost about $50 billion in our exports. So this money, around 50 billion, has been what African countries have been able to borrow from the IMF and other international or multilateral lenders in order to finance their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, paling in comparison to the $6 trillion that direct fiscal stimulus that's been provided in the rest of the world. So what you're seeing, obviously, is a divergence in countries' capacity to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as what we will see next in terms of the distribution of vaccines, as well as how that will have an impact on the economic recovery post COVID-19. And here you've got a depiction of the number of vaccinated individuals per 100 people in the population. And African countries are currently averaging around 3% or 3 people per 100 people who are fully vaccinated, in comparison to the rest of the world, where they're anywhere between 20 and 30 per 100 people vaccinated. And this also highlights the difficult road ahead in terms of the economic recovery, but also plans to support the economic recovery by institutions such as the IMF, which has proposed a $50 billion plan, which involves vaccinating at least 40% of the population in all countries by the end of 2021. And if you look at where we are now versus these plans, it's almost impossible that we will reach these targets by the end of the year. And this is intended to reach an even greater target of 60% by 2022. So I think even if the IMF is able to provide this additional package to African countries, as we've started seeing in terms of the additional allocation of the SDRs by the IMF, which African countries are expected to benefit from, I don't think that this will result in the targeted level of vaccination on the continent. Nonetheless, multilateral partners as well as multilateral financing institutions have also made a commitment to invest at least $80 billion in private sector in Africa over the next 5 years. And so my question, or this to me leads to, the elephant in the room being, yes, there are all these plans, but will there be capacity? Because ultimately, for the economic recovery, we need to have a certain level of control over the COVID-19 pandemic, and that depends on the level of vaccinations, which is currently the best response that we have. And even though countries have made, and then the international financing institutes have made all these plans to invest this amount of money, I just don't see them reaching some of the targets. For example, the IMF target is highly unlikely by the end of this year, and which means that the other investment in private sector, which is supposed to spur on economic activity, is also unlikely to materialize. And so what one should expect is also a delayed sort of economic recovery, which again then has an impact directly on the informal economy and livelihoods, to which the entire or a large portion of the population on the continent still depends upon. And I think in conclusion and in response to this, there are 3 points that I want to highlight. The first being that, the recovery will be largely dependent on what African countries can create for themselves and the kind of context that we can create. And this will require significant planning in industrial policy and investment in order to ensure that we have increasing industrial capacity to substitute some of the imports which we don't need to import. And we still need African countries to band together in terms of lobbying for their various interests, such as what we've seen with the lobby on debt relief and what we've seen on the lobby on the TRIPS waiver, which, although has been a great success, still has had mixed results at best. And so with all that said, the industrial policies and plans to replace some of the imports will also need to find a way to accommodate the inclusion of the informal economy in order to ensure more equitable distribution of income at a national level, but also across the continent. Because I think without this, we're headed for the divergence that I highlighted, which is being reinforced not only by the different or divergence in talks at a regional economic integration level and a trade level versus what is needed for the informal sector, but also at the level of countries' ability to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as that aiding to issues such as vaccine access and equitable distribution, as well as the economic recovery post-COVID-19. And I think with that said, I would like to see countries taking a more active role in terms of economic planning and policy, but also improving in their industrial policy cooperation across regions and across the continent, and continuing to band together in order to lobby for our interest in the global economy.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sia. What we'll do now is that we'll have a Q&A session for both panelists. We'll have a Q&A session for both panelists. And then one question I would like to ask first, before anybody else goes ahead, is that, so basically you mentioned that, so basically the impact in terms of percentage. So Nigeria had a negative 1.8 and South Africa had a negative 7.0% impact. What do you think basically sets these two countries apart in the manner that COVID-19 has affected them? What does Nigeria have that South Africa doesn't have? Yes, may you please shed light on that? Thank you.
Okay, so you want to respond to the questions one at a time, or do you want to have a sort of group or bundled response?
We can have a one at a time question, yeah.
Okay, so I think to highlight the difference between Nigeria and one being that the Nigerian economy depends highly on commodity exports, and that largely being crude oil. And at the same time, the mining industry as a share of GDP is quite negligible. I think it's anywhere between 15 and about 30% or a third of GDP. And again, the Nigerian economy, almost half of it comes from the informal sector, informal economy. So as a result, it has been able to be much more resilient than an economy like South Africa, which has a sort of unregulated capital account or sort of open financial account, and also a highly concentrated formal economy like South Africa. So as a result, the economy has suffered severely due to, so firstly, the financial flows. So its inability to access foreign direct investment, which it relies on in order to balance payments, because South Africa maintains a current account deficit, whereas Nigeria has a current account surplus. So as a result, it has been able to be more resilient, despite the fact that oil prices have collapsed because of its ability to borrow, partly from the IMF, but again, the internal resilience of the economy, which depends on, I think 50% of the economy is the informal sector. So I think those are really the structural differences that have led to the divergent impact in the two economies. But again, these economies have also taken a knock, as you can see in terms of the contraction, but obviously far less severe in the case of Nigeria. But again, what Nigeria has been able to absorb in terms of GDP and its production, it's actually suffered more in terms of its external sector and balance of payments. Hence, it had to borrow much more from the IMF to plug that gap caused by its exports not earning as much. Hope that answers the question.
Yes, you did answer the question. Thank you very much. Okay, so what we'll do now, Mr. Kalbesa, if you have a response to the question that I just asked, please just shed your light on it. And then after that, there's a question on the there's a question on the Q&A. Anonymous attendee, would you like to ask this question yourself, or should I go ahead and ask it for you? Please just write in the chat box whether I should ask it or not. And then, basically that. Mr. Kalbesa, please share your response if you do have any.
All right. In fact, Sia has explained it in a fantastic way, so it's hard to add more. So there is a structural difference between the two economies that has been excellently depicted by Sia. Nigeria is basically a sort of gigantic low-income economy than a vibrant middle-income economy, but just by the virtue of exports of oil, it has a big GDP that puts it above bracket, but just the way its economy is structured is more in sync with countries that are really at lower levels of development. Obviously, South Africa is a much more, in fact, the most advanced economy in the region. So that sets them apart. And interestingly, Sia has also mentioned the fact that a huge chunk of the Nigerian economies are informal by nature. So that sector has lower links with international trade. Basically, that's what has taken the bigger hit, import and exports, and also capital. So that sector doesn't rely really on the movement of international capital or international trade. So for that reason, it has been vibrant. So in a lot of countries like Nigeria, you see a GDP figure that's not highly affected, or it didn't show a big decline, but you see considerable falls in export earnings, and because of that, reserves and capacity then to import and so on. I could in fact add Ethiopia in this bracket and many others. Another thing probably that I would like to add is sometimes you have a longer term effect of past macroeconomic trends. South Africa has had challenging years in the recent past. Although it will be difficult to clearly separate those, I think these shocks often have the tendency to exacerbate the adverse impacts of already prevailing adverse effects on the economy. So, for example, if you have a high unemployment, low economic output, below potential targets, already suffering international trade links, already weak financial position, and thus already subdued financial inflows, international financial inflows. Just an additional layer of setbacks are going to further amplify the effects of those existing shocks. That's all. Thank you.
No, so thank you so much, Mr. Kalbesa. Okay, so we have a question right now from, okay, Anonymous. And the question is, I'm not sure who it's directed to, but yes. The question is, how do we justify saying vaccination is a best response in a continent that's managed to be somewhat open without vaccine levels of the westernized countries? And with the current statement on ineffectiveness of the vaccine to the Delta and other variants. And then the second follow-up question is, should we not be using healthcare strategies and interventions that have shown success within the continent while focusing on capacitating ourselves to be producers of healthcare products to lessen this dependency on the West? So yeah, I think what this person's saying, what is the point of using the current vaccine, knowing that there are still other variants? Is it conducive? And then, yeah, I think they're also saying that, I think they're speaking about reliance to the West. Yes, I think Mr. Sia, this is directed to you. Can you please answer this? And then Salim, you had a question. Would you like me to ask it for you, or would you like, yeah, to ask the question yourself? Please respond in the chat box and we can move over to Mr. Binza. Thank you very much. Hello, sir. Mr. Sia, were you able to hear what the question was?
Yes, sorry, I thought we were waiting for Salim to make a comment. Okay, I can respond to that. You know, the issue of vaccination has become almost as controversial as like the God question, does God exist or not? So I'm going to be clear on one thing. There's just no response to the COVID-19 pandemic that excludes the public healthcare response. Currently, the vaccines are really the best way to contain the virus compared to any other alternative, which is currently on the continent being lockdowns or restriction of people, movement of people and goods. That's largely just, scientifically, it's quite there that, even countries globally that have been, more open in terms of their restrictions, but have implemented successful vaccinations, have been able to contain the spread of the virus. So all I'm saying is that the public healthcare response is the only way we're going to be able to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And yeah, I'll be interested to hear what other healthcare responses the questioner or the participant was referring to, apart from the vaccination. I don't know what else our medical system can do besides that.
All right, noted. Thank you for your response. I hope that has answered the question. Salim, you can go ahead and ask your question. And then, okay, I'll just state on the chat box, yeah, who can go next, but thank you. You can go ahead, Salim.
Sorry.
I've allowed you to talk.
Unmute. Okay, got me. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. I thought you could ask the other question, but I thought I'd come in here and just remind ourselves that when we're talking informal sector, informal economy, as the ILO would like to call it, it's basically an illegal economy. In other words, it doesn't pay tax. It de facto doesn't exist in terms of IMF, and they're starting to think about that. So I give them some credit. But the reality is that it doesn't exist. Now, when we talk about, engaging that sector, on what basis do we begin to start engaging a sector that doesn't, in fact, legally exist? Now, I've done a bit of work, and I'm still doing some work on the informal economy and apprenticeships in the informal economy, and trying to drive that, to in the African context. But the challenge is, we're trying to engage. We're trying to engage in almost a phantom, in a sense, without the reality that this is an important sector, and it needs concerted attention. But as long as the international kind of monetary system doesn't legitimize it, we are in for a hiding to nothing. So just some comments around that. Sia, I like the idea about import substitution, because I don't think we've done enough in Africa in terms of looking at the potential that COVID, and I don't like to use the word potential, that COVID has in terms of trying to get some homemade, homegrown products, and trying to get our economies in play, and trying to get our employment and a whole range of other things in play. So I found that to be useful. But if you can just talk about how do you begin to legitimize a sector that's in fact illegitimate? For me, that's the biggest issue. Thanks.
Zolika, do you want me to go ahead, or do you want Sia to answer? Or Sia, do you would like to answer it, or?
No, it's okay. Both of you guys can shed light. Please just watch the time frame. Thank you.
Okay, so Sia, an interesting question. I think the existence of the informal economy is not something that governments can deny, and it would be unfair to exclude also a large number of workers, especially in many much less developed countries in the region that work. So by some estimates, about half of the economies of many countries in the region are informal by their nature. So you cannot exclude half of your workforce, half of your population while counting those people that depend on the income of those informal workers and their families. So you have to be careful how you approach this. And also, even going by this paying or not paying tax definition, just because they don't pay, for example, typical taxes such as value-added tax or personal income tax or corporate tax or what have you, it doesn't mean they don't pay any type of taxes. A lot of times they pay market fees and many other type of fees during their operation. And often they also tend to buy items before they sell them. So it's a sort of hybrid legal and illegal way of operation. But just to reinforce your point, obviously, a lot of countries work in mind in the future that this sector shrinks and formalization is an enduring work. And often you also see that in practice. As an informal worker, grows his or her business eventually. Once they become large enough, they cannot escape becoming formal, as there are also specific benefits of being formal. So you see a transition from an informal to a small and medium and so on enterprise. I hope that answers it a bit. Over to you.
Thanks, Kelbesa. Yeah, it's a very interesting question indeed. So I agree with you. I think, firstly, because they're not paying sort of corporate or company tax, doesn't necessarily mean that they're illegal entities. And I guess just by the sheer volume and the capacity of the informal sector, it's impossible to deny and ignore. And I think largely the problem you're pointing to is a problem of policy and government being able to accommodate and integrate the informal sector through policy. One example for me that sticks out quite clearly is the South African taxi industry. South African taxi industry caters for upwards of 60% of actual commuters. However, it's highly informalized, and even through the process of taxi permits, government hasn't been able to formalize this. But I can definitely tell that whatever approach government has in terms of public transport policy or public transport investment, there's no solution that doesn't integrate the taxi industry. As we've seen with the failures of the bus rapid transit systems in Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, which failed purely because it didn't integrate the existing routes and existing economy created by the informal taxis that cater for more than half of all commuters. In the same vein, though, other alternatives, which may not be perfect, but a slightly better approach is the Rea Vaya in Johannesburg, which has formalized a large chunk of what was formerly taxi drivers as part of the bus rapid transit system, Rea Vaya, and integrated them in the process of rolling out that bus rapid transit system. And it's still an operational bus rapid transit system because of its integrated approach. So I think in terms of planning and development, I don't think, especially in a country like South Africa, which has the highest levels of inequality, if we are going to go according to sort of market approaches to dealing with inequality and ensuring that people, there's more equitable distribution of income, South Africa and countries on the continent need to plan in a way that incorporates the informal sector, that accommodates it. Yes, you may not be able to accommodate it the same way you'll accommodate a multinational company because of its large level of contribution to tax, etc. But the point is, you can't necessarily talk about national development or national planning without a plan of how you're going to coordinate or incorporate the informal sector, especially if you're going to be looking at trying to redistribute incomes to benefit the most poor in the economy. Otherwise, in the absence of economic planning based around the informal sector, we're then forced to more, sort of anti-market policies, such as expropriation without compensation, or even allocative assets, etc., prescribed assets in terms of prescriptions on pension funds, etc., which to me, yes, is an effective way to deal with income distribution, but is an anti-market approach. So if we are going to try and approach redistribution through the market, we have to include and find a way to plan with the informal sector.
Noted. Thank you very much on your response. One question that I do have is now that do you guys think that the government or all institutions, whether private or public, do you think that the efforts that they have made do include the informal sector? So meaning that have they tried to actually include the informal sector in alleviating, making conditions and becoming better, given that, how much attention are they actually given, and is it enough? Yeah, that's one question I do slightly have.
I can come in quickly, just using South Africa again as a case study. If you looked, for me, the COVID-19 pandemic provides a clear crisis that could be used to formalize certain parts of the informal sector, but also to incorporate the informal sector in the planning. But what we've seen is a far greater focus, obviously, on large business, particularly the exporting sectors, whether that be through the 200 billion loan guarantee scheme, which provided, I think, only committed around 12 or 15 billion of the 200 billion. But that's paling in comparison to the approach that government was going to take towards the assistance to the taxi industry, for example. And again, the crisis is an opportunity for government to incorporate the informal sector and formalize certain parts of it by providing economic recovery, even if that's in the form of physical infrastructure for informal traders, or even loans or even grants to informal traders, but then in return require some level of formalization, whether that be through permits or registration of companies or tax compliance, etc. But the point is, this pandemic and the economic recovery approach that governments are taking is an opportune time for government to incorporate the informal traders, but unfortunately, we're not seeing enough of that taking place.
Okay, thank you for your response, sir. It gives me relief to hear you say that it is taking place, but we have not seen it. And I think at the end of the day, if we're looking at a progressing society and all of that, I think it's honestly important that support for informal sectors should be given. And I think also before it's too late. But yeah, thank you. Alfred had a question. I just gave him the permission to talk. He can raise his question and then we'll take 2 other questions and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are, sir.
Thank you. I just wanted to check, I think it's with Sia, as to, has research actually shown if the informal traders, who, in my view, who should be dominating in the traditional medicine markets, and especially in Africa, and I know that it's not conventional, but is there any notable participation of this sector from research that can we hear about?
So I'll respond, but I think Kalbitsa might also be able to be in a position to respond. So unfortunately, I don't undertake any sort of micro level research, mainly just at the macro level. But if I can speak about the dilemma of what you're presenting, is that the problem of the informal sector being unregulated and providing traditional medicines to a pandemic is not going to be a strategic way to resolve the COVID-19 pandemic. There's just a rigorous process that is needed in order to ensure that whatever sort of medicaments or medical response that is provided to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic actually meets scientific and certain requirements, which I think the informal sector either doesn't have the capacity or capital or assets in order to participate in that process, or in many ways ends up being isolated. So there's one example there in Madagascar where they had COVID organics, basically umhlonyane or Artemisia plant, which was even being promoted by the president as an alternative to or a traditional response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The problem is that despite the scientific process that went through in Madagascar, the actual COVID organics medication itself has proven to be ineffective. And despite personal beliefs about these things, and they vary from one person to the next, the fact is that the effectiveness and the efficiency of some of these traditional medicine is either untested, or even when they are tested, excludes the informal sector. And in the case of Madagascar, they've actually proven to be ineffective in comparison to the high levels of, the so-called scientifically proven efficacy of vaccines. So I think that creates a bit of a dilemma that, would be a problem in what you're suggesting. But over to you, Kalbisa, in case you've got anything else to add.
I also have a bit of hesitation. One thing I can allude to is obviously you have traditional medicine sectors across Africa, and obviously these are often done by informal workers to a large extent, but specifically as it relates to COVID, I don't think there have been a lot of studies conducted, but whatever studies exist, at least of these prominent proposed medicines, there hasn't been any that actually passed through vaccine, through efficacy in terms of its effectiveness. So although certain medicines in certain countries have been promoted by prominent individuals and politicians, to a large extent, I think the reception to that is more negative than positive, I would say. But at least for other types of medication, obviously, you do have an informal, traditional medical sector. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much for your response, Mr. Kalbisa. I have one more question for you, and we have one more question for Mr. Binza, which, okay, so basically the question to Mr. Kalbisa is that you mentioned that countries like Uganda, basically in the information that you shared, you mentioned countries like Uganda, and I forgot which other countries, but you mentioned that they have, I think also in Kenya, you mentioned that they have low savings and finances. And given that, okay, cool, we're given that we have sort of dealt with COVID-19, or we still are in the process with overcoming our economic decline, what do you think is the solution into serving basically the countries that do have low savings and finances, given the informal sector? Yeah, what do you think the solution is to that? If you were to rethink economics or structure it out, how would you do that? Yeah, what would basically be your solution? And then in a nutshell, Mr. Sia, what do you think today's topic, what do you think, how do you think that contributes to rethinking economics, even when it comes to the foundation of setting up informal sectors and their contribution, etc.? Mr. Kalbisa, we will start with you. Thank you very much.
All right. I think to a large extent, some of the policies that are already in paper, either legislated or not by governments, policy proposals that exist by years of studies, policy proposals reflected by people in think tanks, all those that have been directed towards promoting small-scale businesses. They can, with some minor modification, be applied, in fact, to informal workers. Because sometimes the gap between informal businesses and, let's say, sort of formal micro or small enterprises is not that big. So, for example, one of these prominent workers to help these small and micro enterprises grow is obviously by facilitating access to finance. Obviously, they don't have a lot of own capital or saving, so they don't need to go to large formal financial institutions or banks. So to help them, a lot of microcredit institutions and so on have been set up. So by doing the same or helping those existing microcredit institutions and cooperatives extend their businesses to informal workers, obviously through some minor degree of formalization, then we can help obviously help those informal workers to also help the sort of formalization of the informal sector and informal workers over time. So I hope I understood your question, and I hope that answers it. If not, you can clarify. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, you have. Mr. Sia, can you just confirm that you understand my question?
Sure. So look, for me, the short response that the process of regional integration obviously involves the movement of people and goods. And I think the discussions and the agreements that have taken place are focused far too much on the movement of goods. And I think for true integration, we will have to find a way to incorporate the free movement of people as well, and destigmatize the movement of people across the continent. And that starts by catering for the informal economy, predominantly, particularly because a large portion of the population still depends on the informal economy. And so for me, it's quite clear from this discussion that whatever discussions are taking place in terms of regional integration at a continental or regional level also need to find accommodation and expression for the informal economy in order to promote the movement of people along with the movement of goods and the promotion of intra-Africa trade. And that's all, thanks.
Noted, that was very clear. And then just one more, I'm so sorry. What have there been positive aspects from the informal economy in terms of dealing with COVID-19 and trade? Yeah.
I don't know if Kalbisa wants to give a go. I think he did mention the general resilience of the informal sector, but I don't know if he wants to respond to that.
Can you kindly reiterate your question, Zulika?
Oh, sorry, sir. Yes, I was asking, are there any positive attributes in the manner in which the informal sector and basically African trade has the informal sector and African trade been able to overcome certain elements of COVID-19? So I'm just asking if there are any positive elements despite the virus.
Yeah, in fact, at the initial early phases of the COVID-19 outbreak, the estimates or forecasts were catastrophic outcomes in developing countries and much subdued shocks to richer countries. But as it turned out to be, in fact, it became the reverse. And this already attests to the resilience of developing countries, and a large chunk of it being obviously because of that informal or if not informal domestic economy. So a large part of the economic activity and trade and exchange of goods and services is sort of self-contained and isolated from international trade or international shocks. So for that same reason, that sector has turned out to be resilient. The only considerable shock that researchers we have been trying to measure was there were really strict or stringent blanket restrictions on movement, restrictions on trade. So such aggressive lockdown measures did in fact have some adverse effects in those early days. But once governments realized the damage was a bit too high, and obviously there was also a very strong pushback by the public, also through demonstrations and so on, even so informal traders, for example, fighting with policemen and so on. So once those sorts of pushback really turned the policy space into more or less business as usual, even if obviously there was some health shocks because of that, because there was basically no restrictions, no spaces, no hygiene requirements extra. Because of that, these people did suffer in terms of health, but its economic effect was subdued for that same reason. And indeed, it's a very resilient sector. Over.
That's it. Thank you, sir. There's one more question in the chat. So the person basically asks, so Caesar asks, I think so they're basically asking, what's the panelists' view on micro insurance for the informal economy as part of the crisis preparedness? I'm not sure if you guys answered that, but please shed your light if you have not.
Sia, would you like to go first, or?
No, you can go ahead, Kalbisa.
Okay, so Sia is asking about microinsurance, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so obviously, even looking at advanced economies, especially at the outset, basically the insurance business was looking at apocalypse really at the start of this crisis, because everything is every business, everything is going under, so you cannot deal with that. But at least in rich countries there has been a very robust support mechanism because just like the global financial crisis 2008-09, once those key architecture of the financial sector collapses, then everything becomes more like a domino. So you really need to preserve or help that sector. But the trouble is, when you have such a shock that has a very widespread effect on everybody and everything and every sector, then it would be beyond the capacities of insurance agencies or reinsurance agencies or whatever you call them. But obviously, for that same reason, for example, some might have even a policy of not getting involved when you have such a broad spectrum shock because they just can't. But obviously, it will be very good if there was a scheme in which governments and government financial agencies or even central banks and everything can work in tandem with small-scale insurance agencies that are obviously immensely helpful to the most vulnerable workers and the most vulnerable small level business people. We should always remember, obviously, there are few huge companies in some countries that turn huge billions or hundreds of millions of dollars, but the largest chunk of business people or workers are employed or working for small level businesses. So saving the macroeconomy is one thing, but saving the welfare and well-being of the population is another. In some cases, obviously, the two mean the same, but in some cases, they really don't. Especially in crises like this, you might see a very different trend between the macroeconomy and the welfare of the public. So I think it's a very important idea to strengthen micro insurance agencies, obviously, that primarily cater to those small scale and most vulnerable traders. Over to you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think Elvis has really covered the points quite well. For me, it would be just to say, you know, again, the informal nature of the informal sector would make it a little bit difficult to roll out some of these financial products or for financial inclusion generally. But I guess it is all up to, you know, financial innovation to find ways around it. And I would say definitely something that should be looked into. But again, you know, the incomes and the revenue of informal traders and in the informal sector, I'm not sure how much they can accommodate to a large extent these sort of market buffers, even though they're quite needed. Thanks.
All right, noted. Thank you very much to our panelists who have basically availed themselves and enlightened us some way. And thank you for all of you guys for joining us in this session. Please do follow our social media pages as the festival only ends tomorrow. Thank you very much, and yeah, have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.